Welcome to Bach 101, an introduction to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, a presentation of Music Worcester. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Shepard, the Artistic Director of The Complete Bach. Now, let's talk Bach. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à Bach101. Well, it's still Bach 101 and it's still Chris Shepard, but I wanted to make the point by saying hello in French that today we are going to the court of Louis XIV, Louis XIV, the court of Versailles, because there is a very important element in Bach's music, not just in the suites themselves, but dotted throughout his entire repertoire, that owes a major influence to music that was originated in the court of Louis XIV. And this is the dance suite. So we are going to talk about that. But let's begin. If you are a lover of history, you will particularly love the first part of this episode. If you're not a lover of history, well, just stick with me because I want to show you what was happening in the century or so leading up until the time of Bach's lifetime, because it was a time of great foment and great change politically, and that ultimately had a huge influence on musical styles and culture and the arts in Europe writ large. The suites themselves, we will talk about that in today's episode, but I thought it would be better to split my discussion of the suites into two different, probably a little bit shorter episodes. Today's, which is the background first of European politics and the situation that led to the development of the suite, and then talking about Bach's use of the suite. But then in the next episode, I wanted to make a freestanding episode where I simply give you a lot of examples of each dance type, so that throughout the complete Bach, you could go back and refer to that episode if you wanted to understand what I mean when I'm talking about an allemande or a courante or a sarabande or a jig or any other dance types. But first, that history. I want to return to the 1670s. So Louis XIV came to the throne at a very young age in 1643. He was about 5 years old. He was a very long-serving king until 1715. So this is a huge reign and a hugely influential reign. It was under Louis XIV's leadership that France really came into its own as a leader in Europe. So in the 1670s, who were the most important monarchies? So France, because it was under Louis XIV that he centralized control of the country, which had been in a great deal of strife in his father's reign. He increased the military might, and most important for us, lovers of Bach, lovers of music, lovers of art, lover of culture, it was Louis XIV who really asserted cultural dominance. And these things, the centralized bureaucratic control of the country, the military might, and the cultural dominance made France the preeminent power in Europe by about 1670. Well, the Holy Roman Empire, which of course the wonderful quip says was neither holy nor Roman nor empire, is in a sense really quite true, that it's a slight misnomer, and yet the Habsburgs were hugely powerful in concert with the Pope. But after the 30 Years' War, and we're going to talk about that in a second, the Holy Roman Empire was not nearly so dominant as it had been. And though it was fragmented, the Habsburgs' control over Austria, which was their main power base, and their influence within Central Europe still made the empire significant. Important, again, for us, we lovers of Bach, it's important to understand that the German states, which up until this point had been absolutely firmly part of that Holy Roman Empire, the German states gained virtual autonomy, and their significance increased throughout the next century. And Bach was poised to be a part of that. Keep in mind that at the very end of his life, he met Frederick the Great, that great leader of Prussia, and that was really the beginning of a German empire, of a Reich of its own as it came to strength. Okay, well, strap in because we're going to talk about the 30 Years' War for a second. Not the 100 Years' War, which was earlier, but the 30 Years' War, which was from 1618 until 1648. Whatever age group you are in, think about any war that happened about 40 years before you were of age. For example, I came of age in the 1980s, and so my relationship to World War II would have been the same as Bach's relationship to the 30 Years' War, and so on and so forth. If you think of it like that, you can realize that a war that, yes, was 4 decades before Bach, nonetheless cast a long shadow. And the 30 Years' War cast a particularly long shadow and was especially important for the development of Germany. What was it? It was a protracted conflict, primarily fought in the Holy Roman Empire. So this war was essentially in that Central European area. And it was, at its essence, a conflict between Protestant and Catholic states. It expanded into a broader European struggle involving various powers, and this often happens, doesn't it? Think of World War I, that began with a shooting in what eventually became Yugoslavia, and it brought all the various great powers into the conflict and became a worldwide war. The same thing on a much smaller scale happened for the 30 Years' War, and many powers throughout Europe were involved there because, of course, as soon as anybody saw any advantage, they would jump in to see what they could seize at the end of the war. The war ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Now, what did that do? As always happened at the end of these European wars, it redrew maps. It granted territorial concessions between different powers. And more important for us, it recognized state sovereignty. So those smallish German states had a greater deal of independence and autonomy, even if they did come under the sway of one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, as we will see. And in a larger sense, it established a new balance of power in Europe. So what were the political results that especially affected Bach? The Holy Roman Empire, as I said, was weakened, and it gradually became the Austro-Hungarian Empire, led by the Habsburgs. As part of that, the Papal states were weakened economically and territorially by war as others expanded, and the Pope himself would ultimately become more a spiritual authority than a dominant political force. This allowed Germany to rise. And this is what I mean. In Germany, there was a new rule, which was described as, in Latin, cuius regio eius religio. Whoever's realm, his religion. That's what that means. Whoever's kingdom, his religion will determine the religion of his people. And this allowed rulers to determine the religion of their own states, especially important for Lutheran Germany. So the fracturing of the Holy Roman Empire, according to that new way of thinking, this led to the rise of many German states, especially Bavaria, Saxony, and Brandenburg, Prussia. We know Brandenburg because of the Brandenburg concertos, and that was within the sway of Prussia. That is the state, as we now know, that ultimately led to Bismarck creating modern Germany, and then a whole lot of wonderful things, but also some really bad things that happened in the 20th century. Saxony is very important for us because when Bach lived in Leipzig, Leipzig itself fell under the sway of the Elector of Saxony. Meanwhile, France, so I did begin by saying bonjour, Meanwhile, France emerged stronger after the 30 Years' War because of key territorial gains and the weakening of its rivals. Most important for it, the Pope was, as I just said, now more spiritual than political leader, so France could establish its own way of thinking, its own spheres of influences. Perhaps you have learned about Cardinal Richelieu. He was the cardinal advisor to Louis XIV's father, very canny politician. His policies, they had already centralized power in France. And then the war itself elevated France's position as a dominant European power. Right before I end that history lesson, I should tell you that the 30 Years' War was especially brutal in Germany. There was a great deal of famine, there was a great deal of disease, and largely this was because these armies, whether mercenary or volunteer, and much more mercenary than volunteer, they had to find their own food often, and so they would just steal from the people whose lands they were going through or fighting on. And this really did have a very long shadow. The population was greatly reduced. Bach himself would have been very aware of these things and could give us some sense of part of why Bach himself dealt with the theme of death so often, and that there was much more emphasis on the afterlife in Lutheranism in this part of its history. Okay, we're going back towards France. Just hold on for a second, because we want to ask the question, how did that great big recentering of Europe after the 30 Years' War, how did that affect the arts? Well, first of all, we need to understand that Italy, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal States, which had been so important in that period leading up to the 30 Years' War, it had such cultural dominance. Not surprising for us if you think about it, if you think about how important the Renaissance was in Italy and how it influenced how the Renaissance spread throughout Europe, and even in the Baroque. If we think as musicians, we think about Monteverdi and how important all of the great Italian instrumental composers were. This was so important. Italy had so much political and economic power, and there was a great deal of Catholic religious fervor in this period, from the late Renaissance into the early Baroque. Keep in mind that the Counter-Reformation, which was the reaction against the Lutheran Reformation and then all of the various sects that followed off from that. 1519 was when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door. Only a generation and a half later, in 1545, the Pope convened the Council of Trent. This was the great Counter-Reformation movement that would shore up the Catholic Church and its power. Not only that, but there was a great deal of competition between various families in Italy. You think of Medici, for example. These patrons all wanted to create the greatest art and all of those innovative artistic developments. So Italy had cultural dominance up until the rise of France under Louis XIV. What were the reasons for Louis XIV's rise of cultural power? Well, first of all, he grew the palace at Versailles. It had existed, but it was he who really expanded it. It became the palace that everybody in Europe wanted to model their own architectural projects on, but also their artistic projects, because Louis XIV wanted his entire court with him where he could keep his royal eyes on them and know what they were up to. There was also the first appearance of this instinct by the French to control art and culture in a bureaucratic way. And these still exist, these French academies that establish the rules. And this was on the rise during Louis XIV's own reign. So there is the replacement of Italian primacy in culture by French primacy in culture. But at the same time, there is a rise of culture in Germany. So one of the questions that we should ask to understand how Bach's appearance came at just the right time for someone of his extraordinary gifts to synthesize these influences, the Italian, the French, into the German stream. We want to understand the reasons for Germany's emergence in this time. Well, going back to what I said, what happened after the 30 Years' War. This was a time when each state had its own ability to conduct its diplomacy and manage its internal affairs. So at the same time that France was centralizing all of its bureaucracy and all of its governmental activities, the Holy Roman Empire had splintered somewhat. And so now each of these areas in Germany was able to do that on their own. This led to the rise of Brandenburg Prussia, which, as I said, was ultimately Prussia and ultimately then united Germany. The 30 Years' War had been vicious, but there was extraordinary economic recovery after that. That is not unusual. You think about our own boom in the 1950s. And Germany, particularly because there was greater autonomy in these different regions, was able to invest in agriculture, in trade, and in industry. Bach ended up in Leipzig for that last quarter century plus of his life. Well, Leipzig is proof positive of this. These politically fragmented German states, they started to cooperate in different alliances to oppose threats like France. So this is a really fecund period politically and artistically and economically. It was a time when modern Europe really began to come into focus. We can begin to see the outlines of modern Europe. And all of this is important to us because rising powers tend to import goods and culture from major powers as a wealthier leadership class can afford it. They want to look au courant. They want to say all of this new money allows us to play on a much larger field. And of course, if you know anything about the Gilded Age, at the height of the great British Empire, the wealthy in New York, in Newport, really wanted to mimic the great ruling class in England. So anytime you have a major power, and in this case, we're going to say France under Louis XIV, then a rising power like the German states, such as in Bavaria or in Saxony or in Brandenburg, Prussia, they will want to import the culture from that major power. So, enfin, as they say in France, finally we can shift to Versailles and to the French dance suite, which was so important in the music of Bach. So, leaving history behind, but we have given a context to why the dance suite was important, because it wasn't just important musically, though it was, but it was important because it was an avatar of French culture, and French culture meant the cutting edge, leading culture. So if you wanted to be an emerging power of any significance, you would mimic the leading culture. In instrumental suite, well, think about the word suite. This is S-U-I-T-E, which in French means to follow. In ensuite, which now we just think of as a bedroom that has a bathroom, well, actually, that has become a much narrower definition. A suite of rooms is just simply a collection of rooms. And an instrumental dance suite is just a collection of dance movements. These movements and the various kinds of dances that you will hear in the next episode, they developed from Renaissance dance forms, but were really elevated throughout the Baroque period and in many senses left behind the dances themselves that were performed to the music. At first, they were inextricably bound to dancing. Each of these pieces of music that we'll talk about, They were danced by people, and not just professional dancers, by people at the court. They were choreographed. But then, within a couple generations, certainly by the time that Bach was writing, they were shorn of the need to be danced, but they still kept their original flavor, their affect, and their association. So what role did these suites and did the dances themselves play in the court of Louis XIV? Louis XIV was an absolute powerhouse. As he said, "L'État c'est moi," the state it is I, and he controlled absolutely everything that happened at the court. He wanted his courtiers, and that's where the word comes from. Courtier is the people who attend the court. They had to live there because it was by proximity that you could gain anything. And one of the things that Louis XIV did is he had everybody at the court, all these courtiers, had to learn to dance, these elaborate dance moves. He himself was known as a really fantastic dancer. And then when they had these events, people would dance. And yes, there was also a court ballet who would demonstrate the dances themselves. There was always a dancing master, and the tradition was the dancing master would generally have a fairly small violin that he would play on, and he would teach all of these people, all these nobility, to dance. Of all of the French composers, the one to remember is Lully, L-U-L-L-Y, Jean-Baptiste Lully. He was the chief court composer, and it was his style, even though there were others, Couperin, Rameau in particular, that we can think of. But if you think about Lully, it was his style that became the model for the French dance suite. What was in these suites? There were a number of different movements, but 4 movements were generally in every suite. And they were the allemande, courante, sarabande, and jig. And 2 of those words you might know. Jig, of course, this is what we get the jig from, and it is absolutely descended straight from the Baroque jig. Lively, often in da-dee-da, 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 da-da, in some kind of 6/8 or 12/8. The word allemande, which we know, by the way, because they are all descended. Square dancing, that sort of thing. If you've ever heard of an allemande left or an allemande right, that is descended from this tradition. And ironically, allemande means German. Allemande, courante, sarabande, and jig. These are the 4 dance types, the movements that were almost always in a suite. All of the others, you can have some and not others, or you could only have allemande, courante, sarabande, jig, and it would be complete. We learned that in music school to remember it as all cows smell gross. Allemande, courante, sarabande, and jig. Since you're going to hear a lot of suites over the next 11 years, it might not be bad just to take a second to memorize that. Allemande, courante, sarabande, jig. We'll talk about them musically in the next episode. The standardization of the suite emphasized rhythmic clarity, and there are patterns that are part of those different dance forms, but it was all about elegance. This is what the French court emphasized above all else, elegance. So what happened? It began in France, and then it moved throughout. So let's talk about Italy, and in the different countries, often they would say the dance form in the language of that country. For example, courante, which comes from courir, to run. In Italian, they call it a corrente, but we're not really going to worry about that. I think it's best always to refer to the dance forms in French because that's where they began. We went to Italy first. The dance music in Italy tended to be more virtuosic than the French. The French tended to be more ornamented, lots of trills, lots of filigree. Think about the Rococo and this over-brilliance of ornamentation. In Italy, you need to think about those great composers for the violin, particularly people like Corelli and Tartini and above all Vivaldi. So the Italian suite music tends to be more virtuosic. The Italians are also known for a greater lyricism of melodic writing. So these sorts of things are elements of the suite in Italy that we need to pay attention to. So ornamentation in France, the virtuosic nature of the writing in Italy, and then going to Germany, there were many French players from the French courts who would be hired by these increasingly wealthy dukes and margraves in Germany. So they would bring the tradition of French playing to the German courts and there meld with a certain German influence, which, as we know, is more related to this idea of that sober Lutheran writing and, above all else, counterpoint, the use of fugue. Handel wrote many. The Handel keyboard suites are really fun to play. They are easier, as it turns out, than Bach's, very accessible, and Telemann, who was very prolific. But Bach, as we keep saying, Bach was the great synthesizer, the consummate combiner of all of these strands, the combination of the German counterpoint with French ornamentation and Italian virtuosic writing. Not only does Bach come 2 generations after Louis XIV, so all of this had developed, but by this time, the dance suites had really been transmogrified from dance music that was danced by a court to concert music. These could be highly stylized. They functioned as high art under composers like Bach. They were no longer pragmatic pieces of music to be danced to. And Bach himself elevated the suite from that courtly tradition to a form of intellectual and even spiritual expression. Because as we've said, soli Deo gloria, to God alone be the glory. All the music that Bach wrote, whether for the church or not, was for him essentially religious and spiritual music. So remembering that it began with that elegance and the Rococo ornamentation of the French court, and then it moved through the Italian writing, which was more virtuosic, and also, I should say, was more architectural. We have now spoken about the ritornello a few times, so I can mention it again. This is that block of music that would return throughout the piece that allowed the listener to feel the architecture. This is more important in Italy than it was in France. And Bach takes that architectural sense and puts it into his suite as well. Bach's suites are simply more complex and have a musical richness that was not really apparent in the earlier models. Bach, yes, he maintained that traditional dance suite. You will always find, by the way, All Cows Smell Gross, the Allemande, Courant, Sarabande, and Gigue in Bach's suites. By that point, they really were codified, and then adding in the other dance forms. But he could also expand their emotional and technical range. By the way, some of the other dance forms that you will see in the various suites as part of the complete Bach, you may have heard of some of them before: the passe-pied, the bourrée, the gavotte, the chaconne, the passacaglia, the siciliano, which is obviously a very Italian form. In the next episode, those are the ones that I will play lots of examples so you can recognize how each of those dances has a specific sound, flavor, and rhythmic structure to them. Finally, something that has come out much more in the last couple decades, particularly through the work, and I really want to mention them, a musicologist and a dance historian, Meredith Little and Nathalie Gene. They came out with a very important book that established a couple things. First of all, that it is not just in the pieces that are called suites that we find these dance movements. They did a wonderful encyclopedic look at all of Bach's music, especially the vocal music. So once we understood that, then we were able to realize how much spiritual symbolism Bach can attach to these dance forms. So all of a sudden, you realize that these dance suites, they're not just siloed in the pieces that are called suites. They permeate all of Bach's writing. It's really quite extraordinary. And as a conductor of that music, I believe it truly, truly changes my field. And that if conductors don't know that and pay no attention to it, then how could you possibly ever know a tempo? How could you possibly ever know the association behind it? So it's a very important fact. So let's finish by talking about what were the suites that are actually called suites in Bach's music, because these are the ones that through the complete Bach you will see. And because we are committed to presenting music in an encyclopedic fashion, so for example, in the first year of the project we have the 6 cello suites, we always want to present all 6 at once. It makes for long performances, and I realize that, but it is so incredible to be able to hear all of these in one sitting. And that number 6 keeps coming back. I've mentioned this before, that it just seems that when Bach did collections, he often liked to do 6 of something. This is true for the suites. So what are they? Well, there's a lot of keyboard music, and it's some of the greatest keyboard music that Bach wrote. For harpsichord in general, as you know, we often still play these on piano. The 6 English suites, the 6 French suites, and the 6 partitas, keeping in mind that partita was actually a word that was used in Germany a lot. You might think of these as the 6 English, the 6 French, and the 6 German suites. That's how I often keep them in mind. However, it turns out English suites and French suites, these were not names that Bach ever used. We're not entirely sure, but we think that the English suites are called English suites because J.C. Bach, his son, the English Bach, had the scores when he was in England. And then after a publisher will call something the English suites, another publisher would call another set the French suites. It doesn't matter, except that these are the names that we use now. So 6 English suites, 6 French suites, and the 6 partitas. There are the 6 cello suites, hugely famous. We'll talk about that a little bit later this year because you are going to hear Vladimir Fung play those. And then there are the 3 violin partitas. There are 3 lute suites. These are probably arrangements of some kind. It is not thought that Bach wrote for the lute specifically, except occasionally in a piece or two, such as in the St. John Passion. But lute players and guitar players love these, and with good reason. And so I don't want to take them away from them, so we will count the 3 lute suites in here. And then, in terms of orchestral music, there are 4 orchestral suites. I will introduce you to each of these most prominent dance forms. This is really what matters, is to be able to hear a piece, and usually what happens is your first reaction is, wow, that sounds a bit like a dance. And so then the next question is always, what dance is it? And then what you have to do is just keep returning to this chart in your head of, oh, right, that's an allemande because the notes are moving fast, for example. The courante, the notes are moving fast, but it's in triple time. The jig, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, is probably the easiest to recognize, and so on and so forth. So we'll do that in the next episode. For now, you know everything you need to know about the 30 Years' War and its aftermath. You know about the rise of Louis XIV, this extraordinary court that he created at Versailles, and the importance of the artistic and cultural dominance that was then asserted throughout Europe. And so that any nation state, like any of those small areas, those duchies in Germany, that wanted to show that they could play with the big boys, they adopted those French customs of dress, of art, of dance, of music. And that then leads us directly to the extraordinary Bach suites. I cannot wait to do part B of this where you can really hear some music. I prefer to have you hear music in these episodes, and I look forward to that when we can talk Bach. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.